Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever and whenever you happen to be watching this. This will be my response on Lesson 23, The Experiences of War, the Experience of War, rather. And I've just finished up watching Adam's and Naomi's videos. So thank you both for your contributions. I appreciate it. One of the interesting and challenging things about this is, of course, we have 6 books per lesson to go through. And I'm always sort of a little disappointed, a little excited about which ones you've chosen, because part of it, as I sit here going, oh, no student chose this book, so I'm going to talk about it, which is great for me, but you know, you missed the experience of reading it. So I really hope everybody gets a chance to delve into some of these books after the class or at some point in the future, to really gather them, because I think they're all pretty good, or else I wouldn't have chosen them. But obviously, I'm fairly biased. All right, just some administrative things. Starting off, I'm going through the slides, and you're welcome to follow along for lesson 23. Um, administrative stuff. Um, well, as you can see, I'm getting caught up in actually recording my lessons. Still a little sore, but making progress there. I intend to spend tomorrow basically just knocking out as much grading as I possibly can and starting to get caught up on that. And then it's my goal to, by the end of the weekend, be completely caught up on grading. Knocking on wood there. We'll see. Oh, sorry. I'm sorry, May. May, the mostly. What are you? Yes, you're a dog. You're a good dog. You can go back to sleep. Sorry, I knocked on wood for superstition, but I disturbed May, the mostly terrier, who's now got to come up and get a good scratch because she got disturbed when she was sleeping. All right. Anyway, where was I? Yes, that's where I was, May. Where was I? Administrative stuff. I'm going to try to get caught up on grading by the end of the weekend. I appreciate your patience in all of this. Yes, okay. Okay, girl. Hi. Everybody, this is May. You may have met May before. May is my wife's service dog, but when she's not wearing her vest when she's off duty, she is just a dog and acts like it. So anyway, okay. 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 Lap. There we go. There's a good dog. Okay, gonna try to get caught up on grading by the end of the weekend. That's about it. Oh, I didn't put on the slide for this one, but I did want to let you know that the library has all of Oxford's very short introductions available electronically. Those are absolutely fantastic. Of course, the one for our class, the World War II, a very short introduction you're familiar with, but they have lots and lots of them on various topics that may be of value to you in research. All right, you can get down? All right, down, girl. Down, down, down. Okay. All right. That's about it administratively. Oh, next slide. We do have a summer online course, upper division, that we're going to be offering. It's going to be offered as a History 491, and this slide is a little premature. We do not yet have approval to cross-list it as a Chicano Studies course, but I'm telling you anyway. This will be about the Colorado's Arkansas Valley, dealing with agriculture and labor issues. It will be taught by Professor Mike Stephen, who is one of our adjuncts, who's been doing a lot of research in this area. Excuse me. And if you've got any questions about it, do let me know. Or you can contact Professor Stephen directly. He'd be happy to answer them. Again, this will be an entirely online course offered this summer, giving you a chance to get some summer credits knocked out if that's your goal. Next up, jobs. Yeah. I don't envy you looking at the job market in this very unsettled time, but I can offer some pieces of hope, and that is that the historical community is still hiring. These jobs are still out there. Now, this one, president of the Tenement Museum in New York City, not one you're going to be applying to straight out of college. In fact, the Tenement Museum right now is closed to the public, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. They're doing a whole lot in terms of trying to create online or remotely accessible exhibits and things like that. And they're still doing their presidential search. So keep looking at the job market. If you're in the process of applying, I encourage you to continue doing so. And if you're not, start looking for those jobs that you do want down the road someday, and start looking at the education, the experience, and the skills that you're going to need in order for you to get that job. All right, moving on. Yes, ambiguity, ambiguity, ambiguity. Most times when I encounter ambiguity in student writing, it's because you're unsure, or you're trying to disguise that fact. What you're doing is essentially saying, well, I'm really not sure about this, or I don't want to get in trouble, so I'm going to be really vague about it. And it doesn't work. Signs of this are usually slipping into passive voice, disguising agency. I've talked about why active voice is so important. Throwing out the "in my opinion." Hey, I can't be wrong. It's just my opinion. Therefore, don't get mad at me. It's like I was going to get mad at you anyway. But what you need to do is be definite. You are an expert on your topic at this point. You've read the books. You're doing the research. Go ahead and draw firm conclusions. If, however, in your judgment, the evidence does not support a definite conclusion, be definite about that. So look at the evidence and come to the firm conclusion that you can't come to a firm conclusion. Therefore, you can proceed with some confidence to say, I don't know the answer. And the way you signal that is words like possible or probable or likely. They're kind of in an ascending order there in terms of possible means, well, it could have happened, I'm not sure, maybe, maybe not. Evidence is unclear. Probable means there's substantial evidence, not enough to prove it to the point where I can say this is the way things were, but good enough that I can say that that's the most likely outcome, and that's the most likely outcome. It's probable. And then likely is getting up there even further, saying, yeah, this is really close to what happened. I don't have quite enough evidence to be entirely certain. So the bottom line is, when you decide firmly, confidently that you can't be firm or confident, use those kinds of words to clue your reader in. Don't fall back on them because you're not confident. I'm not sure if that worked or not, but well, you got to see a dog, so everybody's happy now anyway. All right, moving on. Wow, we are just flying through this stuff, aren't we? Today is, of course, the experience of war. Next lesson, lesson 24, will be prisoners with Aiden and Trevor. Really looking forward to that. Should be some interesting stuff, and then we'll be moving on through, wow, the end is fast approaching. It's kind of nifty. All right, so we've already covered wartime and the bitter road to freedom and the world within war and Soldaten. So that leaves me to cover Ivan's War and the Crash of Ruin. I think I'll start with Ivan's War, Life and Death in the Red Army, 1939 to 1945, by Catherine Meredale. And this is an excellent book. Meredale is a very accomplished historian, especially an oral historian, and she conducted over 200 interviews to create this book. But she doesn't rely exclusively on oral history. She also did a great deal of archival research, uncovering a number of diaries and journals and letter collections that enabled her to really tell the story of the war between Germany and the Soviet Union in the East from the point of view of the average Soviet soldier. In U.S. Army, the British referred to their soldiers as Tommies, Americans as G.I. Joes, Germans as Fritz, and the sort of generic reference to a Soviet soldier was Ivan, John in Russian. So Ivan's War is about what the war was like from the point of view of the Soviet soldiers. Meredale does a wonderful job of digging into these experiences. Like our other two presenters today, a lot of what she's talking about is horrific. She's telling some very, very unpleasant stories, and this makes it very hard to read in that sense, though the writing is very good, and in that sense it's an easy read. What differentiates the Soviet war experience from those of the rest of the nations is the sheer level of deprivation. Even though the Soviets are on the winning side, the suffering is immense. Something like 8 million Soviet soldiers died in the war. That's maybe close to a third of those that were in uniform. That's a level of casualties that no other country sustained. Add to that the conditions encountered by Soviet soldiers were pretty much the worst. Poor supplies, poor support, lack of rations, lack of uniforms, poor weapons. And while over the course of the war things improved in that regard, they were never, basically Soviet soldiers lived with conditions that American or British soldiers never would have put up with. There would have been mutinies in the ranks for the kinds of rations that the Soviets delivered and that sort of thing. And add to that, the home front was substantial. Earlier on, we of course talked about the starvation in Leningrad, talking about the siege there. But there was substantial malnutrition and even starvation in parts of the Soviet Union that weren't under siege. When the Soviets evacuated their factories, they left behind a lot of population, but they also moved these factories to places that didn't have the infrastructure to support population. Some of the cities of the Soviet Union that were away from the fighting had their populations increased by somewhere between 50 and 100% during the course of the war. And there was simply not time to build apartments or mass transit or utilities to support that kind of population. And the population suffered. Diseases of malnutrition and vitamin deficiency were widespread in many parts of the Soviet Union. Well, not to belabor the point that things were bad, probably what Meredale does most effectively is deconstruct a myth. More so even in the United States, where we have our idea of the greatest generation. The heroes of the Soviet Union, the victors of the Great Patriotic War, the World War II generation became venerated in the Soviet Union, especially under the Leonid Brezhnev regime. From the 1960s until 1982. Soviet veterans were treated a little differently in their society than in any other. For instance, being a World War II veteran meant you got to ride mass transit, public transit for free. You've often seen pictures of Soviet veterans perhaps wearing their medals just on civilian clothes, and that was normal. To have World War II veterans walking around the streets wearing their medals on their normal day-to-day clothes. And with that veneration came a lot of mythologizing, in that Soviet soldiers were portrayed as always patriotic, always suffering, but never abused, always honorable, always fighting for the party and country, always heroic. And of course, we know that that's not what human beings are actually like. So we see a lot during World War II of, excuse me, we see a lot in Meredale's book, rather, of demythologizing the veterans, talking about the things that went wrong. And probably the greatest point there is that the mass rapes that the Red Army committed during their conquest of Eastern Europe and Eastern Germany, which Meredale attributes to a combination of revenge. This is a big part of the motivation of the Red Army because, well, we know what the Germans did when they occupied Soviet territory, and as the Red Army advanced, it advanced across the territory that the Germans had destroyed, where they'd slaughtered people. So the Red Army is uncovering the mass graves and the concentration camps and the slaughter and the destruction. And the sense of revenge becomes very important, but also a sense of conquest. Very literally, to the victors go the spoils. And the women of Eastern Europe, and especially of Germany, became to many Red Army soldiers simply legitimate booty of war to be used and discarded as they chose. That's not something, obviously, that the Soviets, or now the post-Soviets, the Russians, particularly want to emphasize, but it's there. And Meredale does a good job of bringing that out. All right. Setting aside Ivan's War and moving on to The Crash of Ruin, American Combat Soldiers in Europe During World War II by Peter Schrivgers. Schrivgers is a Belgian, actually, though he was educated in the U.S. And this book sort of comes out of an interesting story. During the war, his family befriended a number of Americans who were passing through the area, and they maintained contact over the years. And then several years after the war, Schrivgers visited the American veterans back in the United States. And when he got ready to leave the United States and go back to Belgium, he said all these Americans that had known his family and his family member during the war started giving him socks and sweaters, just piling him up with all these knit socks and warm socks and sweaters and everything else. And he started to get this, what's wrong? Am I not dressed right? Do I look like I don't have enough clothes? And the conclusion he came to was that the American veterans who were giving him these things were not reacting to who Peter Shrivers was at that point when he visited the United States, but to their memories of what they experienced in Europe. And he builds that into a fascinating study of how American combat soldiers experienced Europe. Not how they experienced combat, though there's a little of that there. Not how they experienced being in the military, but how they experienced being in Europe. And he covers everything from comparative mud, how the soldiers encountered mud in North Africa, in Italy, in Britain, in France, how they encountered their allies, the French, the British, their enemies, the Italians, the Germans, what they thought of them, what they thought of the terrain they encountered, what they thought of the culture and the ideas. And he comes to the conclusion that American soldiers who fought in Europe in World War II developed the impression that Europe was in a state of collapse, physically, culturally, and above all, morally. That the old world was in decay, and that the only thing that could really rescue the old world from the horrors of its decay, old Europe, was coming from the outside. At first, the idea that the United States and the Soviet Union were sort of the joint rescuers of Europe from itself. And then as relations between the United States and the Soviet Union deteriorated, the idea that the United States was both the savior of Europe from itself and its protector from the Soviet Union. So you can start to see some developments of Cold War thinking involved here. Shrivers does a wonderful job of digging in. He does some interviews, but mainly he's digging into letter collections and diaries and journals to understand how Americans encountered Europe in various aspects. One of the things he does very well is explore the disconnects between American soldiers or even Americans who were part of the rear echelon forces, so the support troops that would come up behind the front lines, and the frontline soldiers. Soldiers would get a camera in the mail from their families saying, "Oh, you're in France, make sure you take lots of pictures," and well, they're digging a foxhole and ducking down. Or comparisons with family members or friends who had toured in Europe, who had visited Europe as tourists, and American soldiers are clearly not there as tourists during World War II. But in many ways, that was the only way that Americans back home could relate to them, by talking about the things they'd seen. But what Americans saw was very different from the tourist brochures. Relatively few American soldiers saw Paris, whereas almost anybody who goes to visit France is going to visit Paris because that's the capital and the cultural center and everything else, and it's the huge tourist destination, and you get your picture taken in front of the Eiffel Tower and all the things that I did when I was in Europe last summer, and you do things like buy t-shirts, this being one of my souvenirs from Normandy. This is not what American soldiers were doing in World War II. They were not buying souvenirs. They were not taking snapshots. They were not seeing cultural sites. They were trying to survive and to win a war. So that disconnect is something that Shrivers brings out very well. He also does a good job of bringing out the disconnect between how Americans perceived the people that they met and the people that were actually there, if for lack of a better, it's not felicitously phrased, but I think you get my meaning. For instance, the Europeans, military and civilian, that Americans met were surviving under rationing. When the United States enters the war in 1941, the very end of 1941, Europe has already been fighting for 2 years. When Americans actually begin to arrive in Europe in numbers, it's not until late 1942, 1943, and into 1944, and they don't actually get into combat on Europe, in the Northwest at least, until D-Day in June of 1944, though Americans have been fighting in North Africa and Italy before then. The point there is that when Americans encounter Europeans, be they civilians or allies, they're not at their best. And as a result, they develop a very negative impression of Europeans and European life in ways that are distorted. For example, they see Britain and France especially, and then into Belgium and the Netherlands and all, as dirty places. Not much cleaning is done. People don't keep themselves clean. They don't keep their clothes clean. They don't keep their homes clean. Not recognizing at a conscious level, perhaps, that things like soap had been very severely rationed in Britain, and when they get over to the continent and begin to see what's going on, not realizing that Germany was essentially a kleptocratic state, that the Germans had been stealing food, supplies, even something as basic as soap from all the other European countries, because Hitler was very concerned with maintaining morale on the German home front. So he made sure that there were plenty of consumer goods as much as possible available in Germany. This led to this sort of oddity that once Americans actually invaded Germany, they were really, really impressed with how industrious and clean the Germans were. They said, oh, look, the Germans are always clean. They're always washing this. Well, they're the ones who had soap because they'd stolen it from the rest of the continent. But these are impressions that didn't always make it into the full mindset of American soldiers who are experiencing Germany in this way and the rest of Europe in this way. So this is not a book about battles. You're not going to read about tactics or weapons at all. You're going to read a lot about mud and rations and the encounters that Americans had with Europe in various ways. It's a very innovative book. It's well worth your time. Okay, so I've talked about two very different books. We've looked at six very different books. And I hope what we're continuing to do is widen our understanding of different ways of slicing and dicing and looking at World War II, different ways historians can tackle this immense subject. Sometimes we're talking about very traditional military history. Now we're talking about military history of a very different sort. When we start looking at prisoners next time, we're going to start looking at people who more or less by definition did not influence the outcome of the war very much because they were captured. But we're going to be talking about their experiences and how historians have looked at them. All right, I'm going to go read to my kids and put them to bed, and then I'm going to do some grading tonight and grading tomorrow. Tomorrow I also get caught up on the message boards for this class. And I'm working on the email. I know I'm behind on everything, but hang in there. I will get caught up. Until then, until we talk again, I hope everybody's keeping safe, stay healthy, follow the public health guidelines, and we'll finish out the class in the semester. Have a great day.